Hello, everyone. I wanted to tell you about a new study that came out. Actually, it's not that new. It came out in January 2025, so about 5 months now. It completely flew under my radar. It was a study that looked at neurodevelopmental disorders and autism and its correlation with vaccinations. I think it's a very important study. It was published in a peer reviewed clinical research science journal called Science Public Health Policy and the Law, and it was published by Anthony Mawson and Binu Jacob. And the name of the study is Vaccination and Neurodevelopmental Disorders, a study of 9-year-old children enrolled in Medicaid. What they did is they looked at children who were born between 1999 and 2002, and then looked at them when they were 9 years old. And they looked at their insurance Medicaid claims data. They were Florida residents. And they looked at their claims data and looked to see if they had some sort of autism or neurodevelopmental disorder diagnosis. Those included things like tic disorders, encephalopathy, learning disorders, epilepsy and seizures, hyperkinetic syndrome, and autism spectrum disorder or related pervasive developmental disorders. And so they looked at these kids when they were 9 years old and looked back to see what were their vaccinations like and was there a difference in unvaccinated versus vaccinated. So they looked at 47,155 9-year-old children. That was pretty good. And what they found is that vaccination was associated with a significantly increased odds for all measures of neurodevelopmental disorders. And then, two, among children born preterm and vaccinated, there was a 39.9% diagnosis rate with at least one neurodevelopmental disorder, compared to 15.7% among preborn children who were not vaccinated. And the odds ratio for that was 3.58. That means a 358% increased risk if you were preterm and vaccinated to have a neurodevelopmental disorder compared to preterm just not vaccinated. And that confidence interval was 2.8 to 4.57, which means it did not cross 1, which means it was statistically significant. Obviously, 358% increase is significant. And then three, the relative risk of autism spectrum disorder increased according to the number of visits that included vaccinations. So children with just one vaccination visit were 1.7 times more likely to have been diagnosed with autism than unvaccinated, and that was statistically significant with a confidence interval of 1.21 to 2.35, whereas those with 11 or more visits for vaccinations were 4.4 times more likely to have been diagnosed with autism than those with no visit for vaccination. And that confidence interval was 2.85 to 6.84. So, what this study showed was if a baby was born preterm and vaccinated, their risk of autism or neurodevelopmental disorders was significantly higher than a preterm baby that wasn't vaccinated. And that makes sense. Preterm children are still developing. If you're not at the 37-week mark, your body is still growing and developing. I mean, it's argued that you're developing until your brain is developing until you're in your 20s, right? But if you're preterm, you're especially vulnerable. And we're giving these children at least a Hep B shot in the hospital. Now we're doing RSV. And what's in these vaccines, aside from the actual virus or antigen or, inactive virus itself, is aluminum. And we used to have thimerosal in vaccines, which I think is probably in still many of them. We have formaldehyde. We have all of these other ingredients in these vaccines that we're giving to our weakest of weak babies. We're either giving it in utero to the mother or we're giving it to our preterm babies. And the study showed that if we give vaccinations to our preterm children, they have a 40% chance of being diagnosed with some form of neurodevelopmental disorder. 40% compared to already at higher risk at 15.7%, right? It's already a high risk if you're preterm. But now we just tripled, almost quadrupled the risk for these preterm infants. So I found that extremely telling that our preterm babies vaccinated are high risk. The other thing is, even if they're not preterm, this study found that there was a statistically significantly increased risk of developing some form of neurodevelopmental disorder if they were vaccinated or not. So, neurodevelopmental health outcomes by vaccination status in all 9-year-olds. So, preterm, not preterm, didn't matter. Um, they had a 2.8% chance of having autism if they were vaccinated versus 1.1%. So, more than double the chance. So, the odds ratio was 2.7, and that had a significant p value of less than 0.001. Hyperkinetic syndrome, if they were vaccinated, it was 21.1% versus 8.7% unvaccinated. Epilepsy or seizure, the risk in vaccinated was 8.2% compared to only 2.5% in the unvaccinated. Learning disorders was 2.9% in the vaccinated versus 0.4% in the unvaccinated. Encephalopathy, which is swelling in the brain, is 2.6% in the vaccinated versus 0.5% in the unvaccinated. Tic disorders was 0.7%, so pretty low in the vaccinated compared to 0.1% in the unvaccinated. Every single one of those had a p-value of 0.001 or less than. And then if you just took any and all, so that was breaking it down to, this is how many people had tic disorder, this is how many people had autism spectrum disorder, this is how many had hyperkinetic or epilepsy, right? But if they had one or more, they just said simply, if you had one of these or more of these developmental disorders, your risk in the vaccinated group was 27.8% compared to 11% in the unvaccinated group. Again, with a p-value of less than 0.001. So, regardless of being preterm or not, the risk of having some form of neurodevelopmental disorder was 3.12 odds ratio higher, meaning 312% higher risk of having a neurodevelopmental disorder after getting these shots. Now, you're going to argue, well, Brittany, don't you think that the benefits of the shots outweigh the risk? No, I mean, in these kids, you have hyperkinetic syndrome. 21% of children who were vaccinated by the age of 9 had a hyperkinetic syndrome versus only 9% in the unvaccinated. Are you telling me that 21% of kids get measles and 21% of kids get polio? Absolutely not. Not with the sanitation and hygiene and workplace safety and food safety and all of the things that we have significantly improved in the last 80 to 100 years. Absolutely not. The risk is higher of having some form of neurodevelopmental disorder than the actual risk of the disease anymore. So if they were born prematurely before 37 weeks, their risk of autism was 4.7 if they were vaccinated and 1.5 if they weren't. Their hyperkinetic risk was 26.3% in the vaccinated versus 10.6 in the unvaccinated. Epilepsy was 17.5% versus 4.8%. Learning disabilities was 5.4% versus 0.6%. Encephalopathy was 6.5% versus 1%. And tic disorders was 1% versus 0. Zero tic disorders, 0%. And having at least one of these neurodevelopmental disorders, your risk was 39.9% if you were vaccinated and a preemie baby. It was only 15.7% if you weren't vaccinated. So the risk is significantly higher in the vaccinated preterm baby group. And then it broke it down between the preterm and full term. So just looking at unvaccinated, if you weren't even vaccinated, what's your risk of preterm complications versus full term baby complications? So the risk of autism in an unvaccinated preemie is 1.5% in general. If they're unvaccinated and full term, the risk is only 1%. That was not statistically significant. So your risk of autism is not statistically significantly higher solely if you're preterm or you have a preemie baby. It's if you have preemie baby plus vaccine. Hyperkinetic disorders was 10.6% in the preemies versus 8.4% in the full term, also not statistically significant. Epilepsy or seizures was 4.8 in the preemies and 2.2. That was statistically significant. There is an increased risk just in general for preemies to have epilepsy or seizures. Learning disabilities was 0.6% in the preemies versus 0.4% in the full term. No, not statistically significant. Encephalopathy was 1% in the preemies versus 0.5% in the full term, but that number was so low it wasn't statistically significant. Tic disorders was 0 and 0.1%, so slightly higher in the um, full term babies, but it wasn't statistically significant. What that usually means is you can't replicate it. Like there might happen to be one kid in the group that has a tic disorder, but it wasn't enough to make it statistically significant. So um, basically, your only risk that increases significantly is epilepsy and seizures in the unvaccinated preemie versus the unvaccinated term baby. So those numbers are quite low, which is promising and very good news for people who have preemie babies and they're a little bit worried about their babies. Most things are not statistically significantly worse unless you vaccinate your kid. And who are we vaccinating? Our preemies, because we're convincing our parents that they're at risk. So we give them the vaccines and now we're actually increasing their risk. Then the study broke down the autism correlation with the number of vaccines the children got. So they looked at 0 vaccines, what's the diagnosis rate of autism? 1 vaccine, what's the diagnosis rate? So what they found is in the no vaccination group, 0.9% of those were diagnosed with autism versus 99.1% were not, right? For those who got 1 vaccination visit with 1 or more vaccines, they could have gotten multiple vaccines, and they probably did because we usually give several vaccines at once. But if they only had 1 vaccination visit until the age of 9, then 1.5% of them were diagnosed with autism. That means that 98.5% were not diagnosed with autism if they had just the 1 vaccine visit. If they had 1 to 4 vaccination visits, which makes sense from like age 0, right? First vaccination visit is in the hospital, 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, year, right? By the time they're a year old, they've had probably 4 visits for vaccinations. And if they've had 1 to 4 vaccination visits, 1.7% of them were diagnosed with autism, which means 98.3% of them were not. Okay. So then, if they had 5 or more vaccination visits, so between the ages of 0 and 5 years old, they're going to have at least 5 vaccination visits. Their risk of being diagnosed with autism is 2.4% if they've had 5 or more vaccination visits versus 97.6% of no autism vaccine um, diagnosis, right? So then they looked at if they've had 11 or more vaccination visits. So basically, from the time they are born till the time they are 9, most kids have had at least 5, if not 10 or more vaccination visits. But if a child has had 11 or more vaccination visits, they now have a 4% chance of being diagnosed with autism. That's regardless of preterm, full term, doesn't matter. If they've had 11 or more vaccination visits, they have a 4% chance of being diagnosed with autism, which means that the relative risk is 4.4. And this is statistically significant. They found that the p value was less than 0.0001, which means that your risk of developing autism is 4.4 times higher if your child has had 11 or more visits for vaccinations. And it's 2.7 times higher, so more than double, almost triple, if they've had 5 or more vaccination visits. So if your child from newborn to age 5 has had 5 or more, which most have, if you're on the vaccine schedule, your child has had this, they are at least a 2.7 times increased risk. If they've had 11 or more, it's 4.4. So I think this is extremely telling when it comes to how many visits they've had of vaccines and what it looks like with their neurodevelopmental disorder autism diagnoses. So, what does this study show? This study shows that vaccinations in 9-year-olds just in general have a higher rate of neurodevelopmental disorders. It's especially high if it's a premature baby who was also vaccinated. And it's also especially high if the child has had 5 or more, especially 10, 11 or more vaccines. So this is a huge study for me. And I'm annoyed because I haven't heard of this study until yesterday. And then I had to look for it. And usually when you look for it, it's not in PubMed yet because they don't want those kinds of studies in PubMed. And it's hard to look them up online because you get a lot of bias. You get, search bias, right? You type in autism study showing vaccinations increase autism or something, right? And it'll give you like 400 things saying CDC recommends no autism link, blah, 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 blah. So it's hard to find the study. Well, I found it and I will link it in the comments below, in the description below. But it's frustrating when you can't find the data. But this is huge, especially when RFK Jr. is talking about we need to figure out what's causing autism because autism rates are sky high right now. Um, we need to hear about this information. And this was a decent study. 47,000 children were studied, and they found not just some correlation, but there was a statistically significant increased risk. And not just a little bit, it was a lot. Like over 300% increased risk is crazy, crazy to just ignore it. So I think this is important. I think it validates a lot of parents' um, thoughts, thinking, I think this caused my kid's autism or whatever happened with the kiddo. Now, here's a couple of things that I do criticize about the study. One, it was only done in Florida. So, it's pretty generalizable, but there could be some other environmental factors that play in Florida. I don't know what they may be, but you never know. Two, it was done in kiddos born between 1999 and 2002, which means they looked at them around 2012, right? Because they were about 9 years old when they looked at this data. Now they looked at the data now, but they looked back at the data from 2012 that looked back at the kiddos' birth records, right? Why didn't they do it a little bit closer to like our timeline, right? It's 2025 right now. I understand why they didn't want to do it post 2020, right? We have new, totally different way of living life right now with vaccines and who got what, right? So I agree with stopping the study at 2019, but I wonder if they could have done the study between 2010 and 2007 and 2009 or 2010, and then looked at the 9-year-olds in 2019. I think that would have been a little more relevant. We have more vaccines on the schedule now. That may have helped. So those are my two main critiques for this study, but I still think the data speaks for itself. I do think that the autism rates and neurodevelopmental disorders have just worsened in the last 10 years. So I'm sure this data would show even more profound information if it was done more recently. They did break down African American versus unknown race versus European versus Hispanic, and I didn't see anything that stood out in those age groups or those ethnicities. The big thing is these kids, preterm kids who are vaccinated, are at higher risk, and just in general, if you vaccinate your kiddo, they're at a higher risk of neurodevelopmental disorders, and that makes sense with what we're seeing today. If you like this information, my name is Dr. Brittany Todd. I am a pharmacist. I have my page on Sacred Heart Clinical Pharmacy Specialties. Subscribe, like my video, and share it if you think it's good information for other people.